hadn't been searching for romance, not really. At 28, I was making waves in my finance career. Spreadsheets were my language of love, and my cubicle felt more like home than any social setting ever could. Then came the party hosted by Sarah, my coworker and closest friend, who had a knack for pushing me out of my comfort zone. The gathering was a diverse mix: Sarah's artistic and musical acquaintances, along with a few more conventional colleagues from the office. That's where I noticed him. He was engaged in a lively, good-natured debate with someone about the best way to preserve a historic brick building. Tall and slim, with kind eyes and tousled dark brown hair, he wore a worn leather jacket over a faded t-shirt, likely featuring a band logo I wouldn't recognize. A stark contrast to my usual button-down and slacks crowd, but there was something captivating about him. "So you think slapping on a fresh coat of paint is the way to preserve history?" he said with a playful smile. Mark's eyes sparkled with interest as he spoke. "Preserving the structure is important, but don't you think the character and wear give the story more depth?" I found myself drawn closer, captivated by their lively discussion. Just then Sarah appeared beside me, a playful gleam in her gaze. "Mark, this is the spreadsheet wizard I mentioned," she said, giving me a gentle push forward. Mark turned to face me, his smile broadening. "Spreadsheet wizard, that sounds like quite the impressive skill," he remarked, his tone warm and intrigued. "It pays the bills," I replied, feeling a blush creep up my cheeks. "But I can also hold my own in a conversation that doesn't involve amortization schedules." I winked at Sarah, who snickered. "Challenge accepted," Mark said, his voice warm and inviting. "So, Sarah, the spreadsheet wizard, what do you think about preserving history?" We ended up talking for hours about everything and nothing. He was an architect, passionate about restoring old buildings and giving them new life. I told him about my crazy hours at the firm and the satisfaction of closing a big deal. There were no awkward silences, just a comfortable flow of conversation that felt effortless. As the night wound down, we found ourselves standing by the railing overlooking the city skyline. The air was cool and goosebumps prickled my arms. "This was fun," I admitted, surprised by the slight tremor in my voice. "Yeah," he agreed, his gaze fixed on the glittering cityscape. "I wouldn't mind doing this again sometime." "Me neither," I blurted out before I could overthink it. We met with Mark's parents, Martha and Arthur, at a fancy restaurant they picked. The conversation flowed easily enough at first. We talked about the wedding plans, the venue. I'd booked a beautiful old converted library, and the caterer I was stressing over. Turns out organic, locally sourced canapes are a pricey business. Then things took a weird turn. Martha, mid-bite of her lobster bisque, which she pronounced "bicey" with a forced accent, suddenly fixed me with a steely gaze. "So, Sarah," she said, dabbing her lips with a napkin, "Mark tells me you work in finance." "Yes, I'm a financial analyst at a large firm downtown," I replied, unsure where this was going. "Analyst, huh? Sounds important," Arthur chimed in, his voice booming across the table. "You must do well for yourself." Mark, who had been mostly quiet up until this point, cleared his throat. "Dad, come on. That's not what we're talking about. Just making conversation." "Son," Arthur said, waving his hand dismissively. He turned back to me. "So, Sarah, you mentioned a firm. Big name, I presume." I told him the name of the firm, a global player in the financial world. A satisfied smile spread across Martha's face. "Excellent," she declared. "And you say you do well for yourself. Investments, stocks, that kind of thing?" "Yes, I manage a portfolio," I replied, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. This felt more like an interrogation than a meeting with my future in-laws. "A portfolio, huh?" Martha leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "How much are we talking about here, dear?" My jaw dropped. This was outrageous. Nobody, not even my closest friends, asked questions like that. I glanced at Mark, hoping he'd step in, but he just avoided my gaze, fiddling with his breadbasket. "That's really personal information, Mrs. Miller," I said, forcing a smile. "Oh, come on, honey," Martha huffed. "We're practically family now. Isn't that right, Mark?" Mark mumbled something non-committal. His cheeks flushed pink. I decided to take matters into my own hands. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "money isn't everything. Mark and I love each other, and that's what matters most." "Love is great, sweetheart," Arthur chimed in again, "but let's face it, love doesn't pay the bills." I took a deep breath. This dinner was turning into a disaster. "Maybe we should stick to talking about the wedding," I suggested, hoping to change the subject. The next morning, I called my grandma. As soon as I hung up with her after recounting the dinner with Mark's parents, a wave of doubt washed over me. Her words, "greedy and selfish people," echoed in my head, but I brushed it off. Grandma could be a bit old-fashioned sometimes. Sure, Martha and Arthur were a little blunt, but they seemed genuinely happy for us. Maybe they were just a bit awkward when it came to expressing their emotions. Fast forward a few months, and wedding planning was in full swing. Everything from the venue to the flowers felt like pulling teeth. Whenever money came up, Mark would give a sheepish shrug and say, "Work's been a bit tight lately." His parents, bless their hearts, kept offering suggestions, cheaper venues outside the city limits, a family friend who did amazing catering for a discount meaning they'd barter for vegetables from their neighbor's garden. Needless to say, I ended up footing most of the bill. Mark, ever the charmer, would say things like, "You're amazing, honey, handling everything like a champ," but his lack of financial contribution started to grate on me. Finally, the big day arrived. It was beautiful. The weather cooperated, the food was delicious, and most importantly, Mark and I said, "I do." The only sour note was Grandma. After the ceremony, she pulled me aside, her wrinkled face etched with concern. "Sarah, honey," she said, her voice low, "be careful with those in-laws of yours. They don't have your best interests at heart." I rolled my eyes. "Here we go again, Grandma. They're just excited. They love Mark. They love me. Everything's fine." The honeymoon phase was barely over, with the leftover wedding cake still sitting on the counter, when the first major in-law incident occurred. It was a Sunday morning, and Mark and I were still luxuriating in bed when a loud thump from downstairs shattered the peaceful silence. We exchanged a confused look. Then Mark mumbled, "Probably the mailman." The thump was followed by a cacophony of rustling paper and muffled exclamations. Throwing on robes, we hurried downstairs to find a scene that could have been ripped straight out of a horror movie. Well, a horror movie with a lot of floral wrapping paper and gaudy gift bags. Martha and Arthur were sprawled on the living room floor, surrounded by wedding presents like vultures picking over a carcass. They were tearing into boxes, oohing and ahhing over some items, tossing others aside with dismissive grunts. "What in the world is going on here?" I demanded, my voice laced with disbelief. Martha, mid-unwrap, looked up and flashed a megawatt smile. "Sarah, darling, just admiring your lovely wedding gifts." "Admiring?" I sputtered. "It looks more like you're ransacking the place." Arthur, holding up a crystal vase and squinting at it, snorted, "Relax, sweetheart. Just sorting things out. Can't have all this clutter lying around, can we?" Clutter. These were gifts chosen with love, hopefully by our friends and family. But before I could voice my outrage, Mark spoke up. "Maybe they should just leave the presents unopened, right?" he said, his voice mild. "Exactly," I chimed in. Rel wasn't completely oblivious. Martha scoffed. "Don't be silly, honey. It's rude not to open presents. Besides," she added, her eyes gleaming, "we might find something truly special in here." Special for them? That much was clear. I watched in growing frustration as they picked through the gifts, setting aside anything that caught their fancy: a silver picture frame, a set of engraved wine glasses, a fancy cheese board. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "These are our wedding gifts," I said, my voice firm. "Not yours to take." "Look, honey," Martha said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "We just saw some things that would look lovely in our new house. You know, the one we're decorating." They were redecorating with our wedding gifts. The anger bubbled up inside me, threatening to spill over. "What about the gift you got us?" I asked, my voice tight. Martha paused, her hand hovering over a box wrapped in fancy floral paper. She rummaged through the pile, finally pulling out a small, oddly shaped package. With a flourish, she handed it to me. I unwrapped it slowly, my heart sinking with each layer of tissue paper. Inside was a cheap glass statuette, the kind you'd find at a discount store, adorned with garish plastic flowers. My stomach churned. This was their idea of a wedding gift. Maybe Grandma was right. Maybe I'd married into a nightmare. The wedding gift incident was just the tip of the iceberg. Martha's shopping spree became a regular occurrence. She'd call all chipper and ask me to join her for a girls' day out. What it actually meant was me being her unpaid personal shopper. We'd browse stores, and inevitably, Martha would find something she absolutely must have. Then at checkout, she'd do this weird shuffle with her purchases and mine, muttering about forgetting her wallet and how it's such a hassle with separate bags. By the time the cashier figured it all out, I'd be stuck paying for both our stuff. Arthur wasn't much better. Weekends were his prime visiting time. He'd waltz in unannounced, plop himself down on the couch, and proceed to spend the entire day glued to the TV, inhaling whatever snacks I had on hand. When I finally built up the courage to ask him why he spent so much time at our place, he looked at me with a straight face and said, "Saves money on groceries and electricity, doesn't it?" The audacity of the man. Did he think we were running a charity? Mark, ever the peacekeeper, just rolled his eyes and muttered something about Dad just needing some company. The birthday dinner was the final straw. I decided to treat myself to a nice night out at a fancy restaurant to celebrate another year older and hopefully wiser. Naturally, I invited Martha and Arthur. Big mistake. The menu was a confusing array of French names and unfamiliar ingredients. Undeterred, Martha and Arthur ordered the most expensive dishes, pronouncing them with a confidence that belied their complete lack of knowledge. Halfway through the meal, Martha declared the escargot too slimy and pushed the plate away. Arthur choked on a mouthful of bouillabaisse, spraying a gout of saffron broth across the table. The entire evening was a disaster. By the time the bill arrived, my blood pressure was through the roof. The cost of that meal could have fed us for a month. And guess who offered to chip in? Nope, not Mark. He just sat there, oblivious, while I choked out a strained thank you to the waiter and reached for my credit card. Back home, fuming and frustrated, I finally confronted Mark. "How can you just let your parents walk all over you like that?" I demanded. "Come on, babe," he said dismissively. "It's not a big deal. They're just, like that." "Like what?" "Selfish and entitled." "Mark, this isn't okay." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I love you, but you've got to pick your battles. My parents are, my parents. They're not going to change." Maybe he was right. Maybe I had been naive hoping to change them, to somehow mold them into the in-laws I'd always dreamed of. But the reality was staring me in the face. Martha and Arthur were who they were, and that wasn't going to change. The birthday dinner debacle was a turning point, but not the end. The in-law gift-giving strategy became painfully clear. Shower us with cheap, impersonal trinkets on holidays and expect extravagant presents in return. A framed picture of a lighthouse for Christmas. Try a top-of-the-line espresso machine for Mother's